I just want to be aware of my environment when I walk around, and I want to see things, new things. I want to see something that makes sense to me, and then I want to pass that on. If I see it a certain way, you know, that maybe I can capture that in some other form. I was going to school in Boston, and I was searching for a new piece to make, new idea, a new thing to do. During the time, you felt a real separation in the country. The Cambodian War, going into Cambodia, the Vietnam War. Also, the space program was going on, and rockets were going up and separating. And the Beatles split up. And I was in a relationship that was breaking up, so everything seemed to be separating. And I thought I'd do something to express that. Found a rock that I liked the shape of. Just happened to see it in a room at my school. So I snagged it and took it with me, and took a while to figure out how to cut it in half, and I finally cut it with a saw, sanded it off. You know, and I did that piece, the primary separation. And then I left Boston and went to Yale, and I think I ended up dumping all that stuff, but I cut the rock off. And Joe Thompson came to my studio, which is in Salisbury, Connecticut. And he said, "Boy, can you make that big?" I said, "Yeah, I always thought of it as big. It just, you know, have to find a rock." Kind of an honor to make something that from a model of something smaller. Somebody asked me to make it large. Jump at the chance. You have to publish your work or get your work out. That's the hardest part. But you have to meet people, be fortunate enough to meet people that can help you do that. In general, that's what we all want. All artists want their work to be seen. If they have an idea, you have to make the art. Then you have to get the art out. But you need help, like a book foundation. The most important thing is just that I work, that I continue to work, that I work on something that means something. You have to keep being fascinated by things.
Welcome, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. Thanks for coming out on a very rainy Saturday morning to be here with Don. Don, I think I'm going to start, you know, it's often in this case of like sometimes in our young life, and since this is about life and work, I'm going to start with some life because it's clearly embedded in your work as well. But sometimes it's as if the idea that maybe a creative being would never be able to find the path forward to being an artist. Sometimes being an artist is what's calling you out from regardless of your circumstances, and you know that this is going to be part of your own destiny. And I'm really interested in your, you know, that youth, or if there was a moment that you can reflect on that something happened that sparked that in you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that I started drawing on paper, painting a little bit before I knew there was a thing called art. Yeah. But I didn't think much of it, except I knew it was something that was almost like I had a special bag of marbles that other people didn't have. But I kept doing it, and then when I was in grade school, 6th grade or so, I took a kind of a Sunday art class with this woman, and started painting a little bit. And then I remember my dad asked me what I wanted for Christmas when I was in the 8th grade. And I said, a set of paints and paintbrushes. And so he got me this little thing about this big with all the colors. And the first painting I made was a portrait of Jesus, even though I didn't really wasn't a big believer, but I liked the painting, I don't know why. And I wanted to do a portrait. Then I left the grade school and went to a large high school. And I ran across an old friend. And I said, what are you taking? And she said, I'm taking art, and I got an A in it. And I thought, boy, you're not an A, and you're not even any good. So I didn't tell her that, but
Gonna boost your grade point average.
Yeah. I needed to kick my grades up a little bit. So I took art in high school, and from then on, I pretty much knew that's what I was going to do.
So you were in Indiana. You talk about that time that you asked your father, you know, for the paint set, and he said yes, and he found it for you. So what was that? Because often there's a moment where our parents will also frequently try to suppress that, you know, it's okay when you're little, and then there's this moment where they start feeling a little vulnerable about your predispositions, let's call it that. And but he didn't. He fell forward to you.
Well, I have 5 brothers, 4 older brothers and 4 younger brothers. So nobody had focused on me. It was all, they were focused, my parents, on everybody. So I was a pretty good kid, and they just let me sort of do my thing. They were surprised, they were supportive. But in high school, my dad tried to get me to go into the Army, and I said, I'm not going to go to Vietnam, no way. They never talked about college. They just saw that I was going to pretty much do what I wanted to do. And I started taking weekend courses at the art school. I'd take a bus downtown and take figure drawing. There was a studio. This is outside Indianapolis. It's still way outside. But I would ride my bike to a little town, and these guys put their paintings out on a fence. And all the traffic going down Route 40, you know, they sold things. So I took my drawings of Albert Schweitzer and Albert Einstein, and they thought, well, this guy's pretty good. Maybe, you know, we can let him put them out in the fence. So I did that, and then they had me make drawings for them to paint, just to make the production faster. And then that turned into drawings they wanted me to make, and then they wanted me to paint them. And the one guy went in, showed him the painting, and he liked it so much, and went back the next day, and he'd signed his name to it. So that's when I said, I can't do this, it's not me. So I quit that, and got a scholarship to art school in Indianapolis, and stayed there 2 years, but wanted to leave the Midwest to go east to the big time, which I still had no idea about, but I knew. I remember Robert, Indiana, came to my school and said, if you're serious about being an artist, you have to get out of Indiana. And I thought, he's right, you know, not for only just developing as an artist, but as a person. So I transferred and went to the Boston Museum School, and got a room at the YMCA in the basement and an Army cot, and you know, for about $5 a week. Very dutiful, went to school, and after the first semester, the dean of the school called me into his office, and I thought, you know, I'm curious because I did everything, I was up to date and everything. And they gave me a Ford Foundation fellowship out of the blue, and paid all my tuition and $100 a week for living. But I still had to get a job. It wasn't quite enough money, so I had jobs after school. Either I worked at a TV station in Boston making sets for Bozo the Clown, and news. I did a lot of lettering for news articles. Then I would go in after school, and a guy would say, the art director, he'd leave me there by myself in the little art room, and had the name of the movie, the actor, the dates, the time. And he just wanted me to leave an illustration each night for the movie that they would show on TV. It was challenging and it was good, but then I kind of thought, well, I just want to be outside more. So I drove a taxi for 2 years.
So you were talking, I mean, I felt a number of kind of critical inflection points in your path. But I'm interested, you mentioned Robert, Indiana, but when you were at Yale, you said that's the point where you started to meet big-time artists.
Right.
So, and I think, you know, most of the artists that I know, it's not always that some particular artist influences their work, but the humanity of an artist that sees something in you can sometimes be a real shift. And I'm interested if you encountered that kind of a moment while you were at Yale with other artists, or if they helped open doors.
Yeah, some were great. I mean, you know, well-known artists, and some just wanted to be introduced to girls or cocaine or something. But some were great. And Richard Serra was he taught there he was my teacher for a couple of years, and he was great. Very practical. It was before he became the Richard Serra we all know. Mm. But he had practical advice about, you know, doing sensible things. You wouldn't think to know him that he would tell somebody you should do smaller things that you could put in a box and ship across the country. Because I was doing large installations in my studio, and just to make money, to get your name out, you have to be out more. And when I was in Boston, I would drive down to New York and go to the Whitney biennials. And I saw a Robert Smithson piece of a bunch of rocks put in a box with open slats. And it just really stayed with me. And from then, I started sort of incorporating stones and rocks in my work. And I did this piece when I was 19, I think. I was a student at the Boston Museum School. Everything was changing. The Vietnam War, they went into Cambodia, so a lot of the schools went on strike. Students were out of school, running around, and the museum school made strike T-shirts that you probably seen in photographs of a fist. And I wish I still had mine, but things were coming apart. We were going into the moon. Rockets were going up, splitting apart, boosters. I was in a relationship that was splitting apart, and then the last straw seemed to be like the Beatles split up. So I thought, man, everything's kind of just coming apart. Mm. So I just had the simple thought of maybe taking a rock and cutting it in half and separating it, suspend it out of context. But underneath was where it belonged in the earth. So it's always underneath grass. Grass is underneath it. And at the time, I hoped that maybe one day I would get to do it in a large size. And I did a whole series of those pieces like that.
So at some point you were, I mean, the shift from like drawing and illustrating, lettering and painting, you made a leap towards sculpture.
Yes, when the school, during the Cambodian uprising and the whole, they made my school all elective. So I switched to sculpture. And I read this book, the most important book I've read in my life. It was by George Rickey, The Concepts of Constructivism. it had all the European constructivists. They had a lot about movement. George Takis, George Rickey, a lot of, and that just gave me so many ideas and a new approach to working, a new kind of avenue to go down instead of thinking about abstract painting or printmaking. Sculpture is very real to me. I'm much more comfortable.
So, you know, fast forwarding out of college, now you're in New York, right? Mm-hmm. If you're working in sculpture, you're definitely in need of tools, studio, some kind of a space around you through which that practice can find its own self-propelled exploration. Mm-hmm. So tell us about that journey a little bit.
Well, I went to New York. Had a friend that I met between Boston and New York. And he said his father was a lawyer for Aristotle Onassis, and they were building a building. He said, maybe I can get you on a job there. And I said, it'd be great. So I went into Abe Tishman's office, in this big office with a big laje behind him, and I'm in my jeans, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a carpenter. I'm a carpenter. I was the head of the Yale woodworking shop. He said, well, you want to make models? And I said, no, I want to work on the building. And he said, okay. So he said, go meet Vinny at 51st and 5th Avenue. And so I started working with these heavy-duty union New York City carpenters, and that was such an experience. But I got to see how the logic of these skyscrapers work, how they make them. And then at the time, would take lumber home from the building, wrap it up in wire, my hard hat, go on the subway and go to my studio, and I had wood and a few power tools, and that was in 1973, 74. And I would, you're young, number one, you don't have a care in the world, you pay your rent, and you make sculpture in New York. What could be better? Painting. Then my life changed. I took a trip around the world. I saved up, I had a NEA grant, a Tiffany grant, and I'd gotten money from a job. I did the whole building, the lofts. And then got a Pan Am ticket. You could go around the world on Pan Am for $2,000. And so I did. And then had a motorcycle accident in Thailand, and came back on crutches, but still got back to my studio and started working. And I got married, and the financial thing changed. Mm-hmm. So I had 4 kids, but
so there was a little interruption there.
Yeah,
on
that's
occasion.
An interruption. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting as you're describing these things. I'm making these connections between the way in which moments of a kind of leaving evidence of care, or exploring something that created a different impact, or using your labor to pull your friends towards employment. And I see this a lot with artists, where there's an interdependence to the work, no matter how much it seems like one might be isolated or one might be working alone, that there's a great deal of interdependence in terms of advocacy or feedback, or how you help each other, how you share different kinds of materials, or in your case, rip them off from the construction site. Yeah. But flipping into some of these sculptures, I mean, the scale in which you were and are eventually working on, there's a certain amount of them where you're going to only be able to make them possible, intersecting with either public lands or a public art process or things like that. So can you talk about some of that piece?
In Boston, I didn't have a kind of a pretty good sized studio at the end. Then I went to Yale, and I got a really nice studio. and I was doing work with stones. And anyway, saw this area north of Hartford that has a lot of red earth. So that really was interesting to me. So I got a friend's truck, pickup truck, and got burlap bags, got them all, like, I don't know, 20 of them, and filled them with dirt. Opened my window to my studio because it was on the ground floor, and just put them in, covered my whole floor with this reddish kind of earth. And then I made a hollowed out space that I thought was like a lake. And then I went out in the fields and got all these rocks and threw them in instead of placing them in, sort of from different angles so it looked natural. And then I made a grid of wires because I was using wire like that. And then anyway, it's difficult to explain, but I had like I was into like surfaces, below a surface and then above a surface. And the lake and all these rocks were under the wire with 2 rocks floating above. Everything was like something above, below. And I did that for a couple, and then I thought, man, I can't do this all the time. Just my whole studio is just a big pile of dirt. But I did two things, photographed them, and I had that as my, and that's what because I would apply for grants and money, and it was always through slides. Everything was from a slide. And then because I was at Yale, I thought I should be so smart. I started reading about Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenology of perception, how you see things. So I stopped doing that, and I did things sort of going back to my construction days of using sheetrock and building pieces of sculpture that you walk around and discover the whole. What you don't see the whole thing, but once you walk around it, it's the whole thing. So I did a few of those, and Richard Serra came, and he thought they were great. So he got me my first show in New York in '73 at 112 Green Street. Then there was way fewer galleries, and people really did go to each other's lofts, and painters went to sculptors' loft. It was just a nice time. And that kind of stopped. I don't know why. Well, studios got to be so expensive. And I was lucky I got a really good big studio on Broadway in Franklin Street. And lived there for a while. And then that became too small. Then I moved.
So, I'm going to move us to questions here pretty quickly so that we can get some of your voice into the space. But as I'm looking around and also, thankfully, in the context of this book, you really get a sense of both the scale, the range, the poetics. I mean, that's, to me, a really interesting part of your work. And even when you were referencing this piece, and at the time, things coming apart, but there's a poetic in the material life of your sculpture.
Yeah, I'm always trying to find that sweet spot. Yeah. I read that Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard. So I was into intimate spaces, making mysterious spaces that you could look into but not go in. But all that, I have a range of things that I do, and there's some people just kind of do one kind of work. And it's good because you can identify that's. I'll go do one thing and I'll just get tired of doing that kind of work. So I'll go to some other part of my, things that I'm working on that I've set aside for a while. And then you can get some space between what you've left, you do something different, then you can go back and kind of pull it back out and usually add to it in some way. And then then there's a whole other thing of site-specific work, which is what I like to do most. Mm-hmm. It's still just for satisfaction from my own sense of purpose that means the most to me, if something's successful. And then you always think, maybe it's not successful, I don't know. Because you really never know. In the beginning, people like it, they compliment you and all that, but you don't live there, faraway places, you don't hear about them. And sometimes I have dreams of people taking them apart, coming upon a sculpture and somebody's tearing it up. It's awful. But that hasn't happened.
You wake up in a cold sweat. So I want to turn now, Don, so we can hear from some other folks. You have a question.
Hello, my name is Rodrigo. I'm a fellow artist and also taxi driver, Uber, Lyft. How does drawing or this other mediums complement the work? Do you go sometimes back and forth? The sculpture happens, then you draw, and then it comes back to sculpture many times, or?
Some sculptures you just don't draw at all. You just start making. Sometimes your head is kind of a blank, and then I can take material and just start adding things together and attaching things. Basically what I do is cut things and then reattach them. I can do that with heavy cardboard, and I can twist the shapes when they're drying, and they'll dry to the shape that I'm holding them. You know, it's a pretty fast process, but once you put two things together, you have a beginning, and then once you add a third thing, then you start having a conversation. And then that just builds and builds and builds, and the more things you add, it just becomes something. And then if it's out of control, you go back and you change with an idea really how you want things to look, you know, from every angle. And then the longer you work, you have a lot of history behind you, and you can go back and you think, you know, I did that piece, you know, a few years ago, but now I could really make it much better and change it and make something totally different, but you're using that same notion you're doing.
Okay, so this one's coming from Lisa in Germany. What comment on some of your art was the most moving one for you?
It changes, it comes, I mean, I remember when I did a model, it was 8 feet high, made out of foam core and balsa wood. And it was for a site in Japan. An Japanese architect knew me, knew my work, yeah. So they flew me over. I looked at the site, I looked at the building it was going to be. It was this government building, and I saw the drawing from a bird's eye view of the building, and I used that as a jumping off point. And this was in a town called Kitakyushu, and it was going to be bombed during World War II, but instead they went, because they had clouds over the city, they went to Nagasaki and bombed that instead. So that kind of just really meant something to me, and I did the piece, and in the very top of the sculpture, it's in the book, I did like an umbrella over the top, and that to me was like clouds over my sculpture that fit in with the sculpture. You couldn't really say, well, that's a cloud. It was all part of it. But when I sent my model over, I was there, and they took it out of the crate, and they took it out, and I said, they're not going to know what I'm doing, you know. And this guy looked at me and said, you've made a beautiful poem. And that meant so much. Just, he didn't have to know it, but to him, it was just beautiful.
You know, I keep thinking across all of this, we have a number of, art students in here and students who will be at the earlier time of their practice. And I didn't speak very much, but when I was listening to you being able to take from this full arc of a practice across the scale of your life and adventures and various experiences, that what you did or what was in you as a child is still in you now, that you can revisit those things. That's a really, I think, super important thing for us to contemplate, you know, our wisdom or our practice or how we gain more agency with our voice or our ideas or our bodies or our contribution into the world. There's certain things that you can keep going back to, and it doesn't make the body of your work redundant. It makes it continuously interconnected to you. And I think that that's a really beautiful gift that he's shared with us as well, because often you don't hear somebody say it, and yet it's there. Sometimes there's a chunk of our life that we will continue remaking and remaking in different kinds of ways because it propels our exploration. An artist, if they know the outcome, then there's really no point in making the work. But the pursuit of that which is unknown is a gift of liberty and a persistence of vision and a generous journeying towards all kinds of problems along the way. And those solving of problems generate tens of thousands of hours of constantly asking where to from here, how best to proceed. And that's a micro question and a meta question. Mm-hmm. And I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you. Thank you.